Hi, I'm Steve Wolf, president of the Beyond Earth Institute. Welcome to this Beyond Earth program titled Space Solar Power. Is it time to actually harness the sun? For those of you who might not be aware, the mission of the Beyond Earth Institute is to establish and sustain a policy and legal framework that enables economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. As we begin, I want to recognize the sponsor of today's event, Space Canada. Space Canada is an organization dedicated to promoting, supporting, and encouraging international dialogue on space-based solar power through research, education, and commercialization. This really couldn't be more relevant to our program today, and we greatly appreciate their generosity. And to tell you a little bit about Space Canada, I want to turn right now to John Mankins. John is the president of Artemis Innovation Management Solution. John is not only one of our very special guests today, but he is also on the advisory board of Space Canada. So, John, can you give us a minute or so about Space Canada?
Certainly. It's a pleasure, Steve. So Space Canada, led by Mr. George Dietrich of Canada, is one of the preeminent organizations promoting an international dialogue on the subject of space solar power. It's been around for more than a decade, and one of its premier activities each year is to sponsor an international student competition having to do with technical studies of the subject of space solar power. And so this is a graduate and undergraduate level competition. And the prize is really exceptional. It's an opportunity for the winning teams to travel to the International Astronautical Congress each year and to present a formal technical paper on the results of their research. And I would certainly encourage everyone who sees this broadcast to go to the spacecanada.org website and to consider competing in this upcoming year's competition. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much. And we'll be hearing a lot more from John in just a couple of minutes. But John, I also want to take a moment to share with the audience that you have agreed to also serve as a Beyond Earth advisor. So this is great news for us, and we certainly look forward to your ongoing involvement with our organization and moving various initiatives forward. So thanks for that. For old school space advocates like myself, space-based solar power, a technology that focuses entirely on benefiting the Earth, has always been considered an economic driver for space infrastructure development. As you'll hear from our speakers today, the technology is very challenging and will force the development of a range of critical in-space capabilities. Space-based solar power represents the next generation of space commerce, opening the way to large-scale commercial and governmental operations in orbit, on the moon, and beyond. And from the perspective of the Beyond Earth Institute, space solar power could be the next stepping stone in our journey towards creating a permanent, economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. And so with that, let me now introduce our moderator for today, Tony DeTora, Beyond Earth co-founder and vice president of Policy Coherence. Tony is also the vice president for government relations at Link Global, and he has a long career on Capitol Hill as a space policy specialist. So Tony, welcome. Tony, as we start this, I really want to share that, as we have discussed before, I was a little unsure about whether Beyond Earth should address space solar power and that potential right now. But you really convinced me that this subject is right on target with our mission and that the timing really couldn't be more appropriate.
Yeah, no, I understand completely, Steve. So, about 10 years ago when I was on the Hill, I convinced my boss to ask the Secretary of Energy during a hearing about space-based solar power. And the Secretary of Energy's response was, well, anything in space is way too expensive. So no, we're not even looking at that. Which, there's obviously that concept in and around it. It's very far-reaching. But of course, the Beyond Earth Institute is also pretty far-reaching as we look at communities of people living and working beyond Earth. So it made sense to me. And there have been a lot of changes and a lot of updates over the past 10 years. So we'll hear a lot about that from our panelists as we move forward with the program.
Great. Look forward to it. The program's yours.
Thank you. And to be clear, I didn't have to convince Steve all that much. So Steve is a longtime supporter of space solar power, though he keeps referring to them as solar power satellites, which is, part of the system. So, but the idea of using solar panels in space to collect power from the sun to serve the energy needs of people on the Earth, it holds great promise. So the contributing effect of fossil fuels on climate change is a critical concern to people around the world. And although renewable energy is increasingly serving some needs, physical limitations greatly inhibit the use of these carbon neutral approaches for primary baseload power. Meanwhile, solar energy systems for spacecraft have become smaller, lighter, more efficient, and less expensive. Large SSP constellations will likely require a large workforce in space to properly assemble, maintain, and manage them. Such activity could be one economic underpinning for the establishment of communities in space. Recent SSP R&D programs, along with advances in computing technology, robotics, materials, space infrastructure, and low-cost launch, have opened the launch window for SSP to move off the drawing board and actually into space. Join us today as we explore our recent advances, how they might play out in practice, and how the nations of the world are approaching SSP, and whether we finally turned the corner and reached an inflection point where we can actually harness the sun. So, with that, I'd like to introduce John Mankins once more to give a brief presentation. So John is the president of Artemis Innovation Management Solutions, but he's also the leading expert in the field of space solar power. He managed NASA's programs in this area from 1995 to 2003. He co-chaired an IAA study of SSP. He also served as the principal investigator of a NASA-supported investigation into his own novel space solar power satellite concept. And as you heard earlier, he organizes the annual SSP student competition sponsored by our sponsor, Space Canada. And he does that with diverse space advocacy organizations around the world. So John, thank you very much for joining us. Why don't you take it?
Tony, thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be here speaking on the subject of space solar power and its policy context. I'm looking forward to the remarks of the panelists that'll follow. So just to get right into it, because of the exigencies of time, I'd like to share with you some thoughts concerning the status of solar power satellites in 2021. Next slide, please. So the vision of space solar power, for those who may not be familiar with it, next slide, please, is quite straightforward. And it's simply that by going to space, one can harness sunlight streaming past the Earth 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a year. And that platforms in a high Earth orbit will be able to receive this sunlight 99.95% of the time or more, and deliver it not simultaneously, but from a location in high Earth orbit, such as a geostationary Earth orbit, deliver it to locations across a wide swath of the Earth below, and do so in an affordable and a dispatchable way. Next, please. This is sort of the food chain for space solar power, how it would work. Obviously, the energy comes from the sun. At the Earth's orbit around the sun, there's about 1,400 watts per square meter of solar energy passing by. It would be harvested in space by a large platform, as shown in this illustration, the SPS Alpha, a solar power satellite by means of arbitrarily large phased array, transmitted to Earth via a high efficiency but low intensity microwave beam, where it would be intercepted and transformed at ground stations back into direct current or alternating current, sent through existing infrastructure to homes and businesses and industries in the vicinity of where it is being sent. So that's the end-to-end concept. And if this looks complicated to you, next slide, please. I'd like to just highlight that this is all we're really talking about. So this test setup, which was done by some interns for Dr. Paul Jaffe at the Naval Research Laboratory for a conference a number of years ago, it demonstrates the end-to-end physics of space solar power satellites. See the artificial sun, the PV array, some electronics inside the plastic box. On the bottom side is an RF transmitter, and down below is a rectifying antenna that receives the light and converts it into electricity, which then drives a LED lamp. And that's it. So it's very simple physics. It's all well understood, and it goes back really decades in time. Next, please. So just to walk through a little history very quickly. Next. So in the 1950 to 1980 timeframe, there were really two giants. Bill Brown on the left in the upper left picture, the gentleman with the gray hair, of the Raytheon Corporation, who invented the rectifying antenna and created the field of wireless power transmission, and Dr. Peter Glaser of the Arthur D. Little Corporation, who invented the solar power satellite as an idea. All the technology for wireless power transmission using microwaves derives from inventions made for radar during World War II. The solar power satellite took those technologies and incorporated them with the new technologies of the space age, such as PV arrays, and integrated them into the concept which I just described. In the 1970s, there were a series of major experiments and demos, and there was a large-scale systems study. But unfortunately, at that time, and using the technologies of the 1970s, the system costs were far too exorbitant for space solar power to be fiscally responsible, even though it was technically feasible. Next, please. During the next several decades, a wide range of technology experiments and research was done, both in Canada and in Europe and in Japan. In the 1990s, it's actually when I got involved in space solar power as a concept. There were new studies looking at whether or not new technologies had come along since the 70s that made space solar power more affordable. And the answer, as we discovered it, was certified in an assessment by the National Research Council, was yes, that there were new technologies that a reasonable roadmap could be put together, and that NASA had done that. That's when I was at NASA. This subject was also looked at by the International Academy of Astronautics. I wrote a book on the subject, but there were several key hurdles that had not yet been overcome. Next, please. Recently, there are some new space solar power concepts I wanted to just highlight. For example, on the far left is a concept, the multi-rotary PV array, which is being looked at by the Chinese Academy of Space Technology and a group of dozens of research institutions around China. In the center, the sort of the spiral-looking platform, that is the Cassiopeia concept. One of our speakers today is Martin Soltau. He's from the UK. I believe he might speak to this a little bit. And other concepts, including the SPS alpha, which I mentioned a few moments ago, and which I'll speak to a little more in just a minute. Next, please. So what are the hurdles that I referred to that have to be overcome? Well, first and foremost, low-cost space hardware. So cost of space hardware is $200,000 a kilogram. That's $400,000 a pound. Space solar power becomes impossible. Remains impossible. The cost of transportation, if the cost of getting anything into space is tens of thousands of dollars a kilogram, space solar power is really intractable. You have to be able to do safe and efficient wireless power. This technology was really validated first in the 70s and is one of the ones that draws attention, but is really quite mature. Financing is an issue. These platforms will be expensive, but as I hope to show you in a moment, on the scale of billions, on the order of $10 billion, not on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. Robotics and autonomous deployment is another key hurdle. However, dramatic advances have been made in the last 20 years. Next, please. Some other hurdles have to have spectrum allocated. So this would be a multi-year process working through the International Telecommunications Union, have to be able to assure the health and safety of the wireless power transmission in particular. There have been a whole range of studies looking at this. One of the reasons to use a low intensity wireless power transmission system is to assure health and safety requirements are met. Have to have orbital slots, and critically, the space solar power system has to be able to, in an evolutionary way, introduce new critical technology advances as they occur. The pace of technology is so fast that if you put up a system that can't evolve, that can't change to meet the opportunities presented by new technologies, then it's you're just planning for obsolescence. Next, please. Now, two of these major hurdles have already been addressed in the last 5 years. First and foremost, there is proof now that the cost of launch can come down from the space is hard, $20,000 a kilogram to low Earth orbit that was unchanged for some 60 years. And this is being done today by major new space companies in the US, in particular SpaceX, with its Falcon 9 reusable, and soon with the Starship two-stage to orbit reusable booster, and by Blue Origin with its New Glenn launcher, which is coming in a couple of 3 years. Or I don't know the precise schedule, of course. But the key point being that both of these systems and others which are now following fast on the heels of Falcon, Starship, New Glenn, is that launch costs have already been reduced by on the order of 90%. Next, please. Another major hurdle was that of space hardware. Well, there's another advance, which is these mega constellations, such as the Kuiper system, such as Starlink, such as OneWeb. These things are only possible because in a modular architecture, spacecraft hardware can be mass produced just like consumer electronics, and operate with great efficiency and great reliability. In particular, if you look at the cost numbers, the Starlink satellites, which are already in large-scale production, 30 tons a month, are on the order of $500,000 per satellite, i.e., less than $2,000 per kilogram for the hardware. This represents a 99% reduction in the cost of solar-powered satellite hardware, and is directly applicable and germane to the problem of satellite hardware for the solar power satellite. Next, please. So what are the economics of today? And in particular, I want to just highlight the question of ground versus space solar. Well, there's a new reality, which is net zero carbon by mid-century. And this is driving all sorts of policy activities, infrastructure, investment planning, policy statements in some 59 or so countries, all committing to dramatic reductions in carbon emissions by mid-century. This is going to drastically tweak, change, transform the economics of energy as we have known them. Next, please. At the same time, although ground solar power is extraordinarily important, gotten to be very, very low cost, and has been being deployed all over the world in many environments, it doesn't run all the time. And even in good environments, you only get sunlight when the sun is shining during the daytime. There are many markets, critical markets around the world, where it can be overcast and raining for weeks at a time. And in those markets, ground-based solar with energy storage is simply not going to be able to do the job. And space solar power, in conjunction with ground solar, can provide for a more effective transition to a carbon net zero future if it is economically competitive. Next. And the recent studies suggest that for the kinds of modular platforms that are mass produced, by, such as we've been talking about, to allow for very low cost hardware with the new launch systems that are now being planned, that the cost of space solar power could be below 10 cents a kilowatt hour, perhaps in the 7 to 9 cents a kilowatt hour range, where the final levelized cost of electricity will depend on the cost of the space transportation in particular. Next, please. So the future of the space solar power option, just in closing. Next. It's important that space solar power be realized for commercial markets and for the global economy within the coming decade. And this can, in fact, be accomplished first through ground and low Earth orbit demonstrations for a few $100 million, then by middle Earth orbit, MEO Earth orbit, pilot plants for $1 or $2 billion, and finally leading to the first operational SPS by 2031 or 2032. So within a decade. And if this can be realized, if this is done, as the progress is being made in robotics, in space transportation, and so on, then space solar power could make a major contribution to solving net zero carbon during the coming decade. Thank you very much.
All right, John, thank you very much for that. So as we look at all of these things, the technical capability, you believe that we've made enough progress over the last 10 years to actually start moving forward on this?
So we have always, going back even to the 1990s, we've had the technical capability. And the real question has always been, what about the economics? And the challenges which I described a moment ago have revolved around a few technical challenges and some regulatory challenges. But I think the fact of the matter is that now that the question of low cost hardware has been answered with a real world example, and the problem of low cost access has been solved by visionaries, meaning Blue Origin and SpaceX, first and foremost, SpaceX and Falcon. Those things have been solved for other visionary purposes, that space solar power could go forward now and on a large scale if we are willing to do it.
Marvelous. Okay, John, I'm going to drop you out now. We'll bring you back in when we're ready for the panel conversation, but thank you. And now I will introduce our next presenter, who is Martin Soltau, Chair of the Space Energy Initiative at the United Kingdom. And Martin leads the space business for Fraser Nash Consultancy in the UK. He directed the recent UK government study into the viability of space solar power as a new energy technology, which could help the UK deliver net zero. He established and co-chairs the Space Energy Initiative, a collaboration of UK space and energy organizations seeking to take forward the development of space solar power. He is a member of the IAF Space Power Committee. Welcome, Martin. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about this UK study and what the UK government's going to do moving forward, if you can share anything there. I believe you're on mute, though, Martin. So,
thank you, Tony, and it's a great pleasure to join this conference. Can you see the slides? Okay, there we go. So I'm going to warm greetings from the UK. Back in April, we completed a 6-month independent study for our Department for Business and Energy into the feasibility of space solar power, and it sparked a great deal of interest. And so over the next 18 minutes or so, I'd like to take you on the journey that we've embarked on here in the UK. We'll start with some context, and then I'll take you through the study findings and why the UK might consider space solar power. I'll touch on the main challenges we see for the technology, and finally I'll talk about next steps, and hopefully a few different points to bring out from those that John gave. The UK has got quite a different environment. So to set the scene, net zero was our government's legally binding obligations to decarbonize our economy by 2050. A number of net zero pathways are proposed, but all have very substantial challenges. As shown here, the scenarios propose a tripling of electricity generation powered by a massive expansion of intermittent energy technologies, notably offshore wind. But this is only made feasible either with substantial energy storage or backup baseload and dispatchable generation capacity. And these, of course, will be essential to maintain the electricity supply and grid stability. Nuclear and biomass offer baseload, but there are constraints on the growth of these for different cost, societal, and sustainability reasons. Carbon capture and storage is immature, requires very high capture rates, and it may be difficult to reduce the high cost. Battery and other storage technologies, particularly the seasonal storage, is currently very expensive. And enormous societal change is another assumption in the pathways, coming, of course, with its own set of challenges. So affordable, abundant, clean energy absolutely underpins our prosperity and our security, and we don't yet have a credible plan to achieve net zero. The answer will lie with innovation in new energy technologies, and particularly sources of baseload and dispatchable power. So Fraser-Nash helps organizations with technology and strategy, and back in the autumn of 2019, we approached the Energy Department with a proposal that the technology needs to be considered, space solar power, and it might give new options to de-risk net zero. And early in these conversations, officials set out their criteria that any new renewable technology needs to offer to be considered seriously. And it's a high bar. It needs to be affordable, resilient, scalable, sustainable, and it must be commissioned in time to make a difference for net zero. And it's certainly should support UK jobs and a host of other attributes. We found that few were aware of the concept, particularly in the UK, and we had to explain what it is and why space solar power is attractive and why it hasn't hitherto been developed. And as John laid out, obviously a solar power satellite in GEO can see the sun for almost 100% of the time. So it offers that potential for baseload day and night through all weathers and seasons. And whilst historically it's been unaffordable, the factors that have combined to change this view include those space launch costs falling by 90%, and that downward trend set very much to continue. John has developed the concept of these hypermodular satellites, and that absolutely underpins the lower mass and cost, and of course the underpinning technologies are maturing. So it's becoming that viable commercial proposition. And this is against a background of real urgency in decommissioning, sort of decarbonizing our economies and increasing recognition of just how very difficult net zero is going to be. So comparing its characteristics as an energy technology against the department's criteria, the case becomes even more compelling. It's inherently safe, scalable, and can provide dispatchable as well as baseload power, giving great flexibility for the grid. And security and resilience of critical national infrastructure is a priority for our government to reduce our reliance on importing fuel or power from other nations. It has low environmental impact with substantially less land usage than wind or ground solar, a very low carbon payback period, and no air pollution or waste products. And finally, those unique characteristics such as the flexibility to beam power to other nations. And that opens up a range of possibilities for export, international collaboration, and supporting humanitarian disaster relief efforts. And in short, it could offer new options for reaching net zero within a mix of renewables. And as we'll touch on later, the development could also align very well with other UK government priorities. So our study was a 6-month-long techno-economic assessment of space solar power to answer the department's key questions. Is it technically feasible? Do the economics stack up, and could it contribute substantially by 2050. Well, we structured the work in 2 phases. With phase 1, we reviewed the literature and we sought sources of independent evidence to confirm the maturity of the underpinning technology. We engaged with senior figures in the research community and defence to identify those engineering barriers, as well as thinking about upside opportunities for the UK. And from this, we studied the development pathways through a series of structured workshops involving leading space organizations, as well as our own experts in the energy sector. And we also compared space solar power with other renewable technologies and looked at energy mix scenarios to consider how those technologies might work together. We examined 3 leading solar power satellite concepts, which all have the ability to deliver gigawatt levels of baseload power and which represent a range of design approaches. John has a taxonomy for the different types, and in that taxonomy, the Type 6 designs, which are represented by SPS Alpha and Cassiopeia, and then we included a Type 2 design represented by MRSPS, and those 3 are probably the leading, economically leading ones, as well as technically most viable. And in particular, we're very grateful to both John and to Ian Cash, who provided their expertise in space solar power, and they generously shared a great deal of technical and commercial information about their concepts, which helped to make our study very authoritative. So just briefly touching on some of the key characteristics which impact the economics. Obviously, the principal functions are collecting solar energy, converting to RF, and transmitting that to the ground rectenna. And I think the main considerations are achieving that high power to mass ratio, keeping the efficiency high through the energy chain, and probably thermal management. And importantly, there needs to be that electronic or mechanical rotational joint between the collect and the transmit elements if they're to deliver base load through the whole orbit. Diffraction physics dictates that the satellites are very large, typically with a transmitting aperture of 1.7 kilometers to give a reasonable power density at the rectenna. But as John outlined, they're very different in construction from a traditional spacecraft, and this high modularity offers both good resilience and low cost deriving from that very high volume manufacture. And with each satellite delivering about 2 gigawatts into grid, they're comparable to a nuclear power station. We concluded that a well-conceived system design is absolutely central to the technical and economic viability, and we concluded that the leading concepts provide those elegant solutions to the many challenges, and there are a number of solution sort of concepts out there that don't provide baseload. And of course, importantly, they don't rely on advances in material science. So low-cost, fully reusable space transportation is a critical enabler and of course, the dominant capital cost driver. In our study, we considered current systems such as Falcon Heavy, near-term systems such as Starship, and future systems such as a single-stage-to-orbit spaceplane, for which the air-breathing rocket engine is being developed by Reaction Engines in the UK. Now, to put this in context, the launch tempo required to realize a constellation of, say, 25 solar power satellites over a 10-year period would need 1 Starship launch every 1 or 2 days non-stop. So that requires a step change in reusability, turnaround time, and reliability, becoming as routine and reliable as an airline freight operation. And several launch providers would be needed to ensure resilience. So there needs to be a transformational change in the commercial launch sector. Of course, space solar power development would give a strong market signal to further encourage this transformation. The rectenna is a key consideration, especially for a small crowded country such as the UK or Japan. It's like a huge fishing net holding the small dipoles, elliptical at shape in UK latitudes and about the size of a large lake. So it needs to be a contiguous area, and it could perhaps be sited offshore and take advantage of existing wind farm grid connections. And National Grid in the UK are already starting to think about the implications. To give a comparison, at our latitude, it occupies about a third of the area of equivalent terrestrial solar. So whilst we concluded that space solar power is technically viable, it is important to be realistic about the risks as Tony outlined at the start. If I was asked to pick the top half dozen challenges for space-based solar power, I think firstly, it needs the space and energy sectors, which historically haven't had to understand each other, to come together on an ambitious development program. So it needs a bit of a shift in thinking. Secondly, governments may be over-optimistic about the current pathways to net zero, and they simply just don't believe that new technology is necessary. Third, I think demonstrating the wireless power transmission at scale from GEO with the retrodirective control system and the high energy efficiency required. Fourth, achieving the high power to mass ratio necessary to underpin the economics. Fifth, the establishment, as we just said, of the fully reusable space launch sector with the right economics and capacity and reliability. And I think probably finally, agree with John, the international agreements on spectrum allocation, operation and orbits for these systems. So during the study, we established a 4-phase, 18-year program with a major demonstration at the end of each phase to confirm the technology readiness level. The final product of phase 4 is a fully operational, first-of-a-kind system delivering 2 gigawatts into the grid, and with all the manufacturing processes, robotic assembly, and the space transportation all industrialized and mature. We also looked for commercial opportunities each of these steps, so that the demonstrators could themselves deliver commercial value, perhaps in a niche market prepared to pay high energy prices. I think I agree with John that this could be probably done more quickly. The pandemic has shown us what we can do as a society if the if the political will and the funding is there. So the work in phase 1 gave us a clear view of the current technical maturity, the development risks, and the steps necessary to develop an operational system. In phase 2, we focused on the solar power satellite Cassiopeia as a reference design for the cost and economic assessment. And our modeling technique uses a Bayesian probabilistic approach, which is ideal for modeling uncertainty. This chart shows the cost of space solar power compared to other technologies in the UK's pathways to net zero. The levelized cost of electricity is estimated at £50 per megawatt hour, and that figure includes a high hurdle rate of 20% to reflect the low maturity and development risk. During development, as the technology matures, the hurdle rate could be expected to fall substantially, reducing the LCOE. And so, for example, with a hurdle rate of 10%, more akin to those other technologies, that would give an LCOE of around £26 per megawatt hour, about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And we concluded that space solar power is competitive with all the other technologies, but particularly so against those which may be considered base load. And of course, LCOE is not the only metric. The characteristics of grid integration are really important, and base load is fundamentally important. We costed the 18-year development program at £7.5 billion, of which a significant element is the cost of space transportation for the first-of-a-kind system. And if we include optimism bias factors, this cost is about £16.3 billion in present value terms. And such a development profile poses significant funding challenges where the returns are only realized at the end of this long development program. And it's likely that public funding will be required to de-risk a substantial proportion. And thereafter, the production cost of each system is around £3.6 billion, which is less than 10% of the cost of an equivalent nuclear plant. On the upside, this kind of public investment in infrastructure can be expected to support a significant economic footprint. Our assessment concluded that there was a good benefit to cost ratio from a development program. Over and above these, we identified a number of broader spillover benefits in areas such as wireless power transmission, semiconductor and photovoltaic technology, autonomous robotic assembly in challenging environments, and by no means least, inspiring the next generation of engineers and scientists. These benefits, combined with the net zero imperative, really should make a strong case for business and for government investment. During the study, we've explored the alignment between the development of space solar power and government priorities. And as well as helping de-risk net zero, it sits very well with policies in energy security and resilience, economic growth and high-value jobs, industrial and regional strategy, and demonstrating environmental leadership. It could also support our international development goals to help developing nations decarbonize. Developing space solar power also supports the UK target to grow our space capability and markets and show leadership in space sustainability. For all these reasons, it does appear that development of space solar power could provide a golden thread of both societal purpose and structure to a range of policies across government. The first ever UK National Space Strategy should be published soon, and we hope it may include space solar power. An incidental aim of the study was to explore the opportunities for collaboration, and we introduced our study to the experts in Japan, JAXA, METI, and Japan Space Systems, and we consulted broadly on international space solar power activities. We concluded that there is a strong international appetite for a collaborative program with our natural partners. So it's been a fairly comprehensive independent study of space solar power. Our overall finding is that the technology offers new and viable options for the UK to deliver net zero, and it makes the cut as a good value investment where the benefits strongly outweigh the costs. Our main recommendation is to embed space solar power as a priority into the net zero pathways and the national space strategy, and many of the other recommendations flow from that. A development program is worth embarking on now for two reasons. It will provide strong economic benefits in its own right, and moreover, if we delay for several years, it will be too late to contribute for that 2050 scenario. This is an energy project, and it should bring energy budgets to the benefit of the space sector. Importantly, it will provide a commercial market for those space capabilities which the UK is currently developing. And space solar power is a use of space which contributes very directly to reducing global warming and mitigating climate change. And it could therefore enhance public support for investment in our space program. The government is deliberating, but it appears to have generated considerable interest at ministerial level, and we hope it may have some influence on UK policy. They should be publishing our report soon. Meanwhile, we have assembled a broad coalition across industry and the research sector in the UK with the Space Energy Initiative. And we've got 26 member organisations across the space and energy sectors and a senior level advisory board being established. We've done this to help join up these two very different sectors, to build awareness and momentum, and to show government that there's strong industry and academic support. So this continues to be an exciting journey, and the political and societal need for new energy sources has never been greater, and the stars do seem to be aligning, and it does seem as though the time is right for space solar power. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Martin. That was very interesting. I did like the phrase, the top half dozen challenges. That was a good note. I mean, there are very many challenges here, right? And working through them one by one is how we have to do it, right?
Well, you have to balance that against the challenges of net zero.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, thank you for sharing this. I'm going to drop you out and we'll bring you back into the panel because first we want to hear from one more person. So I'm going to introduce Jim Keravala. He is co-founder and chief executive officer of Offworld Incorporated. They're focusing on autonomous robotic systems operating in extreme space environments for mining, construction, undersea, assembly, and transportation services. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that space solar power would require a large workforce. Jim has an approach that for a workforce that doesn't include people. So Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can see me okay. And let me get this.
I see we've lost Jim. So he'll be back with us in a moment.
Right.
There he is.
Take two. Can you see me okay? All right. So, apologies for that. I pressed screen share on the wrong, obviously with the wrong window highlighted. Okay, I'm just trying to get this up and running. Okay, we can see the Is the window sharing? Good. And then, fantastic. All right. All right, can you see that okay? How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can see you just fine there, Jim. If you want to maybe click presentation mode, that'd be helpful. We can see both we see the whole
you
kit
got
and
the wrong
caboodle.
screen up. There we go.
Yeah.
How's that?
Maybe press that little monitor icon down there in between the search bar and right below the presentation. I don't recall how to close out of this presentation.
All right, let's not worry about that then. What I'll do is just present from here.
Thanks for bearing with this, everybody.
Good. Okay, we'll go from there.
Yeah, if you could press that presentation icon down
Let's
there.
not worry. The presentation icon.
Yeah, right next to that, the bottom right, next to that little slider.
Yeah, let's not worry about that because
Yes,
I've got
sir.
multiple screens.
I'll let you run.
Got it then. So Offworld is building colonies of machine intelligent robots to undertake expansion of civilization off Earth. We're building robots for the mining, construction, and other sectors. And actually have robots deployed underground right now as well. As Martin mentioned, and as we all agree, we have multiple challenges in terms of climate change and what we're doing, and we need to address this rapidly. Space-based solar power is one of the leading answers to take the entire energy generation capacity and requirement off Earth, and that is also for the mining and other infrastructure developments that we need to take off. So we can use those resources building out of Earth's atmosphere. So Offworld is developing the robotic architecture with the autonomous machine intelligence to do the assembly and integration of these structures in space. We need to do this in the order of thousands of units in parallel, using off-Earth resources for simple structural components where feasible, and then launch from Earth where necessary. And that will allow us to do a number of activities, providing baseload power for the entire civilization by the end of the century, as well as a number of other activities. As we all know, solar power compares very favorably, and space solar power with the uptime is really unbeatable in that context. It's a 24/7 power capability that once you get over the very significant infrastructure development costs, that does reduce. However, we are entering a new era of launch capability that will reduce those costs to Earth significantly. So I think basically, as a quick review of what we're doing at Offworld, we've really architected a capability where we can use our robots both terrestrially and in space for the end-to-end support and architecture of developing and assembling the in-space units of a space-based capability. So with that, it's just a quick snapshot of what we're doing. I'm probably gonna have to jump off rapidly again, but happy to hear from anyone offline and to answer any supporting questions.
All right, thank you, Jim. So while we've got you for another couple of minutes, is that right?
Sure.
Yeah, so let's bring back in John and Martin so we can have this conversation. Thank you, John. All right, and Martin, great. Martin, make sure you're not on mute. and we'll move forward. So let me just ask the first question, which is, in comparison to today's energy systems, and as we look towards the future, the main trade-off seems to be between clean and green systems and capable systems that can provide that base load power, Martin, which you were talking about. So is that a fair way of looking at it? The basic trade-off today is systems are either going to be clean or they're going to be capable.
I think that's right. I think there's real problems with many of the proposed ways of cleaning up the current capable systems. So gas-fired power stations, adding carbon capture and storage adds a massive cost to that. And it's got questionable sustainability and feasibility anyway. So it feels like a real sticking plaster. I suppose storage, if that came along, like battery storage, if we had 100 times cheaper and didn't use kind of rare earth elements, that might be, but it's a long way off. So I agree with you. I think it's either capable or green.
Okay, great. So, and then are there reasons to think that space solar power may not be as clean as we're talking about because it would require the launch of large amounts of mass, and then the implications for the rocket launches? Plus, there's some concerns about objects reorbiting and space sustainability.
So, sorry, if I may, I'll jump in because I'll have to jump off. Let me just jump in with my comment, and then Martin can give the correct version. I think the whole concept of space-based solar power is a multi-generational architecture in question. Mm-hmm. Whatever minor costs and challenges of launch, the burdens due to launch and initial build, we need to think in terms of where do you generate terawatts of power for the future of civilization, and that's the burden we need to be thinking about. That's the burden we need to be thinking about for the future, and over time, if you like, the net present value energetically of space-based solar power over a 50 or 100-year civilization level period is orders of magnitude higher than a terrestrial power architecture. And I think we need to really think forward and think for the future. With that, I'll leave you guys in the capable hands of Martin and John, and Tony. Thank you very much. Sorry to be in and out.
Thanks for joining us, Jim.
Thank you.
And then John, we'd like to get your.
Yeah, so I think a useful way to talk about this is the same terms that are used for terrestrial renewable systems, which is the energy payback time. Mm-hmm. And so because of the day-night cycle and because of seasonal variations in the available sunlight, the time it takes for a ground-based solar array to pay back the energy, i.e. to deliver to the market the energy that it took to make the solar array, because of the high energy intensity involved in making electronics grade silicon, is on the order, depending on the details, between 1 and 3 years. For space-based solar power, because of including the cost of transportation, because of the 24/7 availability of the sunlight and the higher intensity, even with the energy inefficiencies and the wireless power and all those things, nevertheless, space solar power pays back the energy in weeks. 4, 5, 6 weeks at most, something like that. So the difference between the two in terms of energy effectiveness is really quite stark. It's just, you can't beat being up where the sun shines all the time.
Right. Okay. And I imagine that, that's true as you look at like the criteria pollutants in the Clean Air Act as well, those sorts of concerns that if you're burning fossil fuels, you're going to have all that kind of emission. Okay. And then can we touch on land use a little bit? because one of the things that, John, was in your presentation is the Denver International Airport is smaller as a footprint than a receiving antenna would need to be. Can you touch on that?
And so if you conceptualize space solar power on Earth, the receivers, as being like hydroelectric power, you've got a pretty good way to visualize it and think about it, except that it doesn't require water and it's not subject to drought. So the land area for some of the receivers that we've looked at recently is on the order of 25 square kilometers. So less than 18 square miles. For reference, and that delivers 2 gigawatts as an example. For reference, the catchment basin for the Hoover Dam, which also delivers about 2 gigawatts, Lake Mead and its catchment basin, is several times larger than that. So typical hydroelectric facilities, that the Three Gorges Dam system is more than 100 square miles for about 15 gigawatts, 10 gigawatts on average, 15 gigawatts peak. So space solar power can be thought of it like hydro, but you don't need the water, and as providing a much more effective land use than even much less capable hydroelectric catchment basins.
Okay. And now, Martin, unless you'd like to weigh in there, I'd like to shift a little bit to talk about what you touched on about energy independence and exporting energy, and how that would play out with allied nations, competitor nations, and the rise of protectionism that we've seen recently.
It's an interesting point. I think with increasing focus on energy as a really critical resource, and more globalization, I think new structures, global structures may come up, and the great thing about space solar power is it offers these really interesting options for allies to share power, to help developing nations. And it slightly goes back to the previous point about land use. That because of this flexibility, you can place these rectennas in different areas and have that flexibility to either do different things nationally, generating green hydrogen or putting it into the grid, or do things in a collaborative international way. Really exciting. And in fact, our FCDO, the Foreign Office and so forth, are quite interested in those sorts of aspects.
Okay, very good. So, I mean, we've touched on the technical capabilities, and it sounds like we're there from a technical standpoint. And John made the point that from the 90s, we were capable of doing certain things, maybe not economically, but from a technical standpoint. But as we look more at that sort of international technology transfer question, how can we do a better job of making sure, like Space Canada wants to see, international collaboration here? John, do you have insights into how we can move forward to these international organizations that Martin's kind of referring to?
So I think one of the virtues, which we don't normally talk about, of the highly modular character of these solar power satellite concepts that can also be mass produced. We talk about the mass production, the robotic assembly, and so on. But when you're talking about making very large space systems, such as a solar power satellite, but potentially also other things like on the moon or going to Mars or wherever, where you have modular system elements that plug together, like the Legos or like Tinker Toys, anybody can make the block. And so if you can establish standards and interfaces and coordinate the design, not the details, not the technologies, not the chips, but the box, and sort of do it at the black box level, I think there's a window of opportunity for facilitating international participation. Just like you can buy a USB drive from all sorts of countries because the USB interface is a standard. You can use computers from all over the world because TCP/IP is a standard, the interface communications protocol. So I think similarly, these big modular space architectures are going to facilitate being able to coordinate and work with the restrictions and regulations on the sharing of the component technologies, which are sort of each country's secret sauce.
Okay. Well, that brings us to an interesting question, which is, as we use a modular design, and as Jim pointed out, robotics are a real possibility for assembling these. And I think we're in large part assuming that robotics will be either teleoperated or autonomous in many cases. So will SSP require a large number of people in space, or will the robotics sort of undermine that question, that approach, that need? Either of you.
So I go first. Well, from our economic analysis and certainly, John, you were involved in our workshops and were really helpful. If you have substantial numbers of people in space, it will massively increase the cost. You probably inevitably need some element of human spaceflight, but it's predominantly got to be done robotically. And I think the whole point of the hypermodular approach is that it makes this very this environment which is very structured for robotics. It's not like an unstructured kind of planetary exploration kind of robotic challenge. So that, I think it's more of an economic question than a capability question.
Okay, and what's the what's the economic increase, if I could, for?
Well, I can give you the number for the 1979 study that involved hundreds of astronauts and human space stations in low Earth orbit and geostationary Earth orbit and orbital transfer vehicles going back and forth, and the adding hundreds of astronauts and adding them in that way up at the front end doubles the cost.
Okay.
It's because all that investment has to happen before you start generating your first kilowatt hour. Now, if you've got a $10 billion asset in geostationary Earth orbit and something happens that requires, the human factor, something that's unstructured, I think then you've got an economic case for maintenance men. But the fact that you've got an air conditioner repairman who occasionally goes out and fixes an air conditioning unit here and there is radically different than saying, I'm going to build the air conditioner out in the yard next to the house from piece parts. Obviously, you want to mass produce the air conditioner, ship it, and install it. I'm using a metaphor there, but nevertheless, I think it's valid. People will play a significant role, but if we design the system so that you must have hundreds of people up front, the cost becomes unsustainable.
Okay, so let's flip the question a little bit then. Does space solar power enable large numbers of people in space?
Yeah. And I think I'll just jump in, Martin. I think the answer there is easily, absolutely yes, because anywhere you go in the inner solar system, you're going to need lots of energy. And what we're spending for energy in space right now is exorbitantly high by comparison to what we spend on Earth. I mean, it's tens of dollars per kilowatt hour as opposed to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And so the development of space solar power, the development and deployment of hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts and more of cheap energy in cislunar space is going to make all those things that people have wanted to do, like the development of space resources, suddenly economically feasible. Whereas if you tried to do them with today's energy costs, these visions are going to just be fantasies.
I think there's a political angle to this as well, because space solar power is a use of space that would command very strong public support, because it's solving a societal and environmental massive challenge. And so I think there'll be much more support for the broader exploration of space if we can show that space is used so directly for societal good.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting point. And then let me follow up with you, Martin. So who do you think is likely to own and operate these systems ultimately? And that'll help define what life would be like for people who are responsible for,
That's a really interesting question. We've in our space energy initiative, we've got National Grid doing a lot of work in this, working out where they might play in the value chain of a future sort of with space solar power. You could envisage the rectennas being, the standards being set so a rectenna can receive power from any capable and compatible solar power satellite. But it may well be the energy companies who currently transforming themselves from fossil fuels end up being satellite operators. Okay. Or it may be governments.
And it may be governments. Yeah. So, Martin, I'm going to stick with you for a second because I want to ask you about what the UK government's going to do. And I know you can't answer the question, but I need to ask, what are they going to do?
It's a good question. I wish I knew. We've had a lot of conversations with right across government. Mm-hmm. Of course, we've got a real kind of fiscal challenge with the pandemic, putting us into massive debt. So can they kind of see the big picture, the long term? Certainly this government is very pro large infrastructure investments, very focused on jobs. It's very focused on its place in the world post-Brexit. So that's why I think, there's a lot of alignment between current government policy and a space solar power development. It would definitely be in a partnership. And I guess this event is being held just a couple of weeks early because we're on the cusp of finding out, I think.
Right. So the study's not yet available. That's right. It'll be available soon.
We hope so. The report's going to be published, I think, by the government during this parliamentary recess, so before September, the next few weeks. And I expect them to tell us how they're going to take the recommendations forward.
All right, very good. And so let me put the same question to you, John. What is the U.S. government doing, and what should they be doing as we move forward?
Well, there's an ongoing program of record in the Air Force, which is pursuing a space solar power concept for military applications. Okay. It's really not an appropriate system for commercial applications. It's not 24/7, for example. There's been ongoing research at the Naval Research Laboratory, and in the past, there were research and activities within obviously within NASA when I was there, and by a variety of companies. It's a lot of technology development that continues in relevant technologies like Offworld and the robotics and so on. But what's missing right now in the U.S. is a program, a government program to create industry and government private partnerships, public-private partnerships, to pursue in a focused and aggressive way space solar power development, demonstrations, and initial deployments, which could be done within 10 years, so that space solar power can, at frankly a fraction of the cost of some other ambitious energy undertakings, could become a legitimate option in the carbon net zero debate in the coming years.
Wow. So both of you seem very convinced that we can do this within initial demonstrations within 10 years, and then even larger scale within 20 years, maybe to commercialize it within that sort of time frame. Yeah. So, John, let me follow up. What U.S. federal agencies would need to be involved in that?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the lead agency for space technology R&D that has great applicability to the private sector, and in particular in putting these kinds of public-private partnerships in place, is NASA. So I think NASA would have to play a central role in a commercial civilian application. Obviously, the DoD's program should continue. DOE needs to be involved, especially in relevant technology research. The Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce, and regulatory activities relating to spectrum. So it really needs to be a kind of a whole of government approach.
Sure.
With, I think, the DoD carrying the banner and leading on the defense sector side, and NASA leading and organizing events on the civilian side.
Okay, and I think spectrum is probably a huge question on this. So the FCC, obviously, key player there, and our State Department as we engage with international partners.
Absolutely.
Or competitors such as China, who has announced such a program, and we'll see what happens there. Do you have any recommendations for the U.S. government on how to handle that, or you'll give that directly to them?
Well, I would say we certainly need to be watchful of what our global friends are thinking, and even more so on what our global competitors are working on. And China has certainly made it clear that they are pursuing space solar power, and they're pursuing it with an eye towards demonstration and deployment. And to be a leader in this field is to be the leader in energy and industrial development in cislunar space.
Great. Do you have anything to add there, Martin? Or
just from a UK perspective, the UK in space is joining up the civil and military policy for the first time, and of course these big power stations are critical national infrastructure, and whilst defence won't be a leading a stakeholder in developing it, it will have a strategic interest in its defence and protection as critical national infrastructure. And I think it just needs this real joined up government across energy, space, civil and military, industry and academia. It's a real collaborative effort that's needed, and then internationally as well.
All right, great. So now we're going to have our last question, which we ask of all our guests. Martin, I'll start with you. When do you think we'll see the first community beyond Earth? That is, a group of people building, sustaining, and growing an economically vibrant, self-governing society outside the atmosphere of our home planet?
Gosh, I think I have two answers. I think if we're talking about sustaining on the moon or Mars, maybe 2100. I think the main things are, getting this energy provided. So that'll be solar or then fusion. I think if you're talking about really sustainable, I think you may have to. Perhaps we're looking at habitable planets in another star system, and that may be another 100 years on.
I see. Very good. And John, let's pose the question to you.
So I think I'm going to focus my answer on the moon, because that's one that I'm working on a lot lately with my studies under the Moon Village Association. And I will say that because of the breakthroughs in low-cost launch, which are central to making space solar power and big space projects realizable, I think that we will see the kernels, the beginnings of the first permanent outpost leading to settlement on the moon within the next dozen years. I don't think it's as far off. I think that within the next within a generation, 25 years, there could be a permanent settlement beyond Earth on the lunar South Pole.
Wow, great. So thank you both. Let's bring Steve Wolf back in here. Steve,
hey,
great
gentlemen. Gentlemen, fantastic program. Thank you so much, John and Martin, and of course Jim in absentia. It really just listening to Martin and realizing that keeping the focus on this net zero by 2050 with relation to space solar power, I think is really key. And I think that's how we generate the kind of enthusiasm for this. I have absolutely no problem with these systems being built entirely from with robotic means. Whatever is the most cost-effective way of doing it, by all means, that's the way we want to go. I'm so excited about this international dimension, especially with any nation, any developed nation, I would say, that is not really taking space solar power seriously, could ultimately be really behind over the next 10 or 20 years in this area. So it is important that we give a real focus to this. And Martin, we're very much looking forward to that report being released, and Beyond Earth Institute certainly looks forward to sharing that with the folks. So with that, what I want to do is I want to wrap this up. We're already at quarter after. Tony, thank you again, and thank you again, John, Martin, and Jim. Before everyone heads off, we have a very special announcement that we want to make, and it's directly in relation to the topic today. Next week, Tony and John will be unveiling a Beyond Earth proposal on space solar power during a special appearance on a web event that's hosted by the Foreign Press Association. We think that our proposal will have a significant impact on the discussion of space solar power, and I encourage you to attend this event and certainly come to our website for more details at that time. So with that, thank you all again. If what we talked about today is sparked an interest in you in terms of and what the Beyond Earth Institute is doing, we encourage you to become engaged with our organization, get involved, make a donation. Feel free to contact me directly at steve@beyondearth.org, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you very much, and have a great day.